Hey everyone, I'm in the studio with Pastor Ross here, and today we're going to be talking about gender dysphoria, and we're going to look at a few different views that people have taken, maybe can give you some clarity as to how you should think about it. We're going to take a look at it from a biblical perspective, a worldly perspective. Ross, first off, what can you tell us about gender dysphoria? What are we talking about here? What are we not talking about?
Okay, well, first of all, Jake, let me make a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on this at all. I've been reading a lot about it this year for my own benefit, and so I thought I've learned a few things maybe we could share with our viewers today. And when we're talking about gender dysphoria, we're talking about the phenomenon of transgender identity. So we're talking about someone's sense of their gender identity, who I am, as how do I identify the gender that I feel like I am. So there's biological sex, male or female, that's determined by our genetic code. And then some people then have a sense of their gender that's different from their biological sex. So that's their gender identities, who they sense they are. Now, a lot of people get this confused with sexual orientation. So this doesn't have anything to do necessarily with whether you're homosexual or heterosexual. Somebody said that sexual orientation is who do you go to bed with, and gender identity is who do you go to bed as. So that's kind of a little bit what it's about.
Okay, all right. So we've got a few viewpoints that we're talking about today. So what's this first viewpoint?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the identity perspective. And so let me back up for a second, because when we talk about transgenderism, we talk about gender dysphoria in specific. We're talking about this sense of incongruence between my biological sex and my identified gender. Like someone may feel like that they're a woman trapped in a man's body or something like that. That's how people have phrased it. So there's this incongruence, and it causes stress. It causes some psychological, emotional discomfort. So we're going to talk about three ways that people look at that. The first one is called we're calling it the identity lens, or the identity perspective. And so in a nutshell, what that is that's based on the biblical idea that gender, there are two genders are fixed, and there's two biological sexes, the sexes are fixed, and the genders match or are identified with the biological sexes. So this is the approach of Genesis 1 and 2. So we look back at God's original order of creation, and we say, how did God make it work? And we say God made it to work with men and women, separate, fixed, and there's important differences between the two. Gender is a good thing because it reflects the way God made it to work. And so if a person expresses this gender dysphoria or a transgender identity, then this perspective would say that that's out of step, out of character with the way God created the world to be.
Okay, so we see two unique sexes, and so when it comes to gender, that's what there is.
That's what it is. That's the way it's meant to be. That if you're male, you have a male gender and sexual biological identity as well.
Okay. So what's the second view that we've got here?
Okay, so we've got the second one people refer to as the disability view, and that says that really that gender dysphoria is it's a disorder, a psychological disorder, that there's this disconnect. Nobody knows what causes gender dysphoria, if it's a biological cause in the brain chemistry during fetal development or who knows what, but there's this sense that this dysphoria, this disconnect, is a psychological disorder. And so it'd be similar, it would have the same kind of approach to other kinds of disorders that people have. They're called disorders because they seem to be out of the way that the world normally is. And so maybe someone has a bipolar disorder. Okay, so we see, okay, that doesn't mean that that's a sin on their part, but it's something that they might struggle with, and coming out of that, they might make some sinful choices as they deal with and respond to the disorder, or a woman who has postpartum depression after giving birth to a child. That's not a choice that she made, but it's a challenge that she has to deal with that, and so that's more of a disability than it is, say, a sinful perspective or a sinful stance on that person's part.
Okay, so it's much less about whether or not someone's choosing it, but much more of an affliction.
Yeah, that's the idea behind that, yeah.
Okay. Okay. And so what about this third perspective?
And then the third one's called the diversity perspective. And the idea there is that being differently gendered is a good thing, that it's part of the human diversity and all the different ways that humans are made or that humans experience their life. All of that's really good because it's to be celebrated. If you're transgendered, then that's great because then you add something unique and diverse to the human family. And so it ought to be affirmed in every way.
Okay, so how does this match up with biblical perspective?
Well, let's talk about this for a second. Each of these ones has some strengths and weaknesses. And so, the identity perspective is very biblical in its orientation. The problem with that perspective is that sometimes people can make it really black and white, and people can treat everybody who has maybe an experience of gender dysphoria to treat them as some kind of a sinner or counsel them, hey, you just got to stop sinning. And so it's easy for us to be judgmental in that framework. It's easier for us to be excluding people who are different from us. And so there's some cautions there, but I think generally there's a lot of the biblical truth is reflected in that perspective. But then you also have to take into account this disability perspective. There's some really important biblical truths there too, that there's a difference between sin and affliction. And so it really helps to humanize that person and treat them with grace and treat them the way we think that Jesus probably would treat someone and try to help them find redemptive healing or hope or wholeness in their relationship with Him, even if the internal condition doesn't fully change. The challenge of the second perspective is that sometimes it doesn't take seriously enough how our sinful choices can actually exacerbate our inner inclination, or it doesn't maybe take totally seriously the idea that people still do make sinful choices flowing out of there maybe a condition that isn't necessarily sinful itself. And then the diversity perspective, biblically we would say that's really not, we would not affirm that perspective, but we would say there's something we can learn from it. That, yeah, people adopt the diversity perspective a lot of times because they're looking for a sense of identity and a sense of community. And so it's like they're asking, who am I? Where do I belong? And so that diversity perspective is very inclusive and very welcoming to everybody. And so even if we don't believe that that's the case, that we are not, everything is not equally valid, we would say we still need to help people find a sense of identity and to find a sense of community. And that's a great human need.
Well, thank you for that, Ross. That's great. Hopefully that gives you something to think about, have a discussion about it. Be sure to use the questions below in the article as a reference, and hopefully this can help you better understand some views on gender dysphoria.